Just want to start by saying thank you to our committee sponsors, Indoor Weather Professionals, Pilgrim Building Company, and Hill and Wilkinson General Contractors. We're really excited to have all of their support this year and appreciate continued involvement of our allied partners. Just wanted to make you aware of some upcoming events. Next week on Thursday during lunch, May 13th, we'll have our third in the series of 4 events that we're collaborating with AIAU on. And so that'll be the health and wellness event. It'll be an introduction to sort of thinking about health and wellness in architecture with some video content provided by AIAU. And then we'll be having an interview conversation with Gail Vittori, who's a local architect who has worked in the health and wellness and design for health space for a long time. So we're really excited to kind of hear her perspective on how the profession is addressing health and well-being in the built environment. On May 17th, Christoph has organized a great Healthy Building Network event. So we'll have a speaker from the Healthy Building Network, again, speaking about design for health. And the June 3rd is our next monthly meeting, so the first Thursday of June, and we'll be kind of continuing tonight's conversation next month, and we'll get into the details of that in a little bit. June 7th, we have an event. A speaker from the city will be joining us to talk about heat island mitigation and some of the pursuits the city is taking and looking for the design community to take to reduce the heat island effect here in Austin. And then on June 8th, in the evening, we're having our first environmental justice focused event that Jaime has been planning. And we're still kind of finalizing speakers and stuff for that event, but we're really looking forward to a robust conversation about equity and development and some comments on the land development code rewrite. And then on June 17th, we'll have the 4th installment of our AIAU series, which will be about resilience and adaptation. So stay tuned to our social media, LinkedIn, Instagram for more information on all of that and links to registration. But I think right now the May 13th, 17th events are both open for registration, and the other June events should be coming online soon. So keep an eye on the website. So tonight we're continuing our conversation of the draft climate equity plan. We have heard, we hope that the council will be considering the plan for adoption this summer. So first we heard the beginning of this year, but of course everything went a little haywire at the beginning of this year. So hopefully this summer City Council will adopt it officially. And today we're moving on to transportation and land use sections, and we'll be talking specifically about the first 2 goals in that section to focus development in growth centers and corridors. And we'll have 2 great speakers who are going to kind of come at it from a couple different angles. And a little bit this week, and then next month we'll continue our conversation about goal number 2 as it relates to kind of housing specifically and maintaining affordable housing and continuing to develop housing in those growth corridors. So tonight, we're very excited to have with us Cole Kitten from Austin Transportation Department and Heather Hauser from the University of Texas at Austin. And I'll kind of let each of you introduce yourselves and talk about your expertise. But Cole, if you want to take it away, I'll stop sharing and you can present your slides.
Yeah, certainly. While I'm pulling up my slides, just a little bit of background. Cole Kitten, I'm the division manager in Austin Transportation, leading our planning and project development division. I've worked for the city for about 15 years now, and the last 10 being with the Austin Transportation Department. So I'll go ahead and go with my presentation. Okay. So thanks again for having me. We appreciate the channel to be able to continue communicating and coordinating. So this presentation is about the Austin Strategic Mobility Plan, and hopefully most of you have recognized it over the last 4 or 5 years. If not, you'll quickly get up to speed with this presentation, and then we'll talk a little bit about how it's being implemented since it was adopted in 2019. So I'll give a quick overview. We just published a 2-year progress report, and then I'm going to get into implementation focused around street design, priority networks, and how the ASMP may encourage the growth that this group in particular is interested in. So in early 2016, the city started having a lot of conversations about transportation, and we quickly realized we were not in a good position to respond to the growth that we know is coming by 2040. So at the time, our transportation plan that the city operated under was the 2025 AMATP, which was the plan adopted in 1995. So largely, we hadn't really had a transportation plan that had prepared us to align with the comprehensive plan, Imagine Austin. So this growth was really that immediate need to do something. Early on in the planning process, we would looked at what our drive alone commute mode share rates were, and looking out into the future at that growth, we knew very well that if we maintained that 74% drive alone rate, that it just wasn't sustainable. So early on, we did the math and found that at 50% drive alone in 2039 or 2040, you effectively maintain the same number of cars that exist on the road today. So we would be absorbing all of that growth while maintaining the same number of vehicle trips by shifting all of our commute modes to more sustainable modes, transit, walking, teleworking, and bicycling or other. So how all of that culminated was in a plan document itself, but also a street network and map that reflected all of the policies within the document in the street network itself. So it effectively inventoried all of the roads in Austin and identified what their future conditions should be like to achieve the ASMP goals. The plan document itself had 7 chapters that covered mobility from a very comprehensive standpoint, starting with safety, supplying our transportation network, operating, even how our transportation networks impact the environment, as well as our community. So within the plan, there were many elements within it. As you can see, each chapter had indicators and targets, policies. The implementation chapter had 279 action items that we would be charged with following up on. We identified 3 priority networks and multiple network maps, and then that 1 street network table that I was referring to. But ultimately, it really boiled down to a list of top 10 strategies for us to reach that 50-50 mode share goal. First by really reiterating and reinforcing our goal to zero traffic fatalities, and elevating safety as that critical policy. But also at the same time talking about how we manage our congestion by managing our demand, building our networks, and ultimately really identifying that we need to move more people by investing in public transportation. So we just celebrated our 2-year anniversary of adoption, and the city manager and assistant city manager helped us create a special video for that I'll play real quickly.
To approve the ASMP on second and third reading.
On April 11th, 2019,
Those in favor, please raise your hand.
Austin City Council unanimously adopted the Austin Strategic Mobility Plan, a roadmap to guide our city's transportation decision-making for the next 20 years. The ASMP established an ambitious 50-50 mode share goal to help our community manage congestion as we continue to grow. This means in 2039, half of Austinites will get to work without driving alone in a car. They will make that choice to telework, walk, bike, carpool, or take transit instead.
Achieving a better mix of commuting choices is the only sustainable way to support Austin's growth. We want to make sure the city is able to provide our residents and everyone coming here to work or play from neighboring communities as many options as possible to reduce their impact on congestion, to support our environment, and to enjoy everything that Austin has to offer.
In the 2 years since its adoption, City of Austin mobility outcome departments have wasted no time setting the ASMP into motion. We're implementing a new street impact fee program to help fund roadway capacity projects. We're nearing completion on a comprehensive update to Austin's Transportation Criteria Manual, which will modernize our street design standards. We're also implementing critical safety measures quickly using the tools we already have. Austin's Vision Zero program is installing effective, low-cost safety improvements on 13 high-injury roadway sections and implementing speed limit changes and traffic calming treatments through a reimagined, data-driven speed management program.
As a city, we've completed dozens of spot improvements to enhance the speed and reliability of our existing bus service, while partnering with Capital Metro to make sure that we can plan for and implement Project Connect. Not only are efforts to build out the robust roadway networks envisioned in the ASMP well underway, but Austin voters asked us to continue to expand our urban trail, bikeway, and sidewalk networks by approving Proposition B, the Active Transportation and Safety Bond, in 2020.
The City of Austin is committed to transparently tracking the progress of our comprehensive mobility plan. Visit austintexas.gov/ASMP to see our progress and view our action item dashboard. Our vision for our city's transportation future is ambitious, but with your help, Austin, we're getting there together.
Well, hopefully that played all right for everybody to hear. And that's a little bit of a sneak peek of what I'll talk about next. But yeah, I do encourage you all to go to our website, austintexas.gov/ASMP, where we have that 2-year progress report, the video, and a dashboard to see the status of all of those 279 action items. So now, we created this comprehensive mobility plan, adopted it 2 years ago, and now I'll try to bring it home to how it really relates to what you all are interested in. So we'll focus on our Transportation Criteria Manual, the TCM, the priority networks that were created within the ASMP, and then the street impact fees, and all of this and how it encourages growth where we want it. So the TCM, what is the TCM? Basically, any development that's going through the development review process may be subject to the TCM. It's triggered in the Land Development Code, specifically to identify transportation improvements. And then those transportation improvements, the design criteria around them are included in the TCM. So the TCM itself was something that hasn't been updated at all, really, in the last several decades. So everything that you can imagine out there is the built environment has been created based on old standards, or standards that we allowed by waiving the criteria that is currently in place. So this TCM update is meant to be the new foundation or starting point for engineering design decisions. And these design decisions are based on national best practice that we see out there today. So specifically, what we were out to achieve was clearly to prioritize safety for our Vision Zero goals, but also encourage those sustainable modes to get us to that 50-50 mode share through the modernized criteria and street design. And then this image is just an example of one of the updated cross sections that's in the draft TCM today. So the TCM has been a long time in the making, the update to it, and it really started concurrently with the development of the ASMP in 2017 when we developed the street design guide. That street design guide was an opportunity for us to put out new ideas on what the built environment was supposed to look like within the right-of-way. And what we ended up doing with the street design guide was using that as the initial basis to update all of the corridor mobility plans that were approved in the 2016 mobility bond. So it was taking those street design guide standards and actually starting to put them in practice. We also used them as the basis in the ASMP street network table to identify our future right-of-way requirements and identify what we expected the future transportation system to look like. So as you can see in the timeline, really during this time overlapping with developing the ASMP, the TCM was being developed internally. In late 2020, we put out a public draft for comment using the Speak Up Austin platform. In early 2021, we used those comments to finalize the document that was then submitted for a formal rules posting process for interdepartmental review. So that's where we are still today, is in that interdepartmental review step. We're working with our Austin Fire Department to get final sign off and approval on these new standards. And then after that, in the summertime, we'll have a public review period where we'll request review and comments. And hopefully this is where AIA can be involved and help. Go ahead. And then from there, it'll move on to the final adoption by the city manager. So unless we have a question on the TCM, I'll keep moving on. The next area that I wanted to start focusing in on from how the ASMP policy really turns into practical influence in encouraging growth was the identification of these priority networks. This map on the screen is showing the transit priority network as it relates to the Imagine Austin growth concept, corridors and centers. And the idea being is that on these corridors, we established the policy for these modes to be prioritized to improve their operations, which means physically we want to implement special treatments along those corridors, like whether they be transit only lanes or transit queue jumps or any other transit priority infrastructure or treatments. And similarly, the bicycle network has a priority network that is used to indicate where all ages and abilities facilities should be implemented. And then all of that information, as I mentioned earlier, is reflected within the ASMP street network table and map. So you can see just how the priorities within the right-of-way translate to the proposed future condition. So the last point in this kind of combination of strategies to further support and encourage growth along the corridors and centers is actually implementing a street impact fee. So impact fees in Texas are allowed for water, wastewater, stormwater, which we have in Austin, but we didn't have roadway or street impact fees. But it's a fee imposed on new development that's necessitated by and attributable to the new developments. So in order to establish those street impact fees, we had to conduct a study, which we also initiated concurrent with ASMP. But it was in a kind of a two-step process where we really had to align or rely on the ASMP to identify where those streets and capacity improvements were needed. So after the ASMP was adopted, we were able to use the roadway capacity plan to establish those costs that would be attributable to new growth. And the details around the impact fee is that there are 17 service areas where the fees are collected, and you can see those in the map. And the street impact fee was adopted late last year, December 2020. It established basically the maximum assessable fee by the study, but council was able to actually set the collection rates for each of those service areas, and they determined that they would establish a flat fee across all of the service areas, differentiating between residential and commercial. But there's also several fee reductions and exceptions included in the ordinance. And those fees don't go into effect until June 2022. But the primary takeaway here about the street impact fee and how it influences growth is that built into how the fee is calculated, there's incentives or reductions that the development community can take advantage of when they decide to develop in proximity to transit, as well as through internal capture via a mix of uses. But if development occurs on the periphery, then it's anticipated that those developments really would pay kind of their full rate and full costs or street impact fee. So the hope is that this is both a kind of an incentive and disincentive in locating growth in the future. And that's all I had. These sites are resources to learn more about the ASMP, the TCM at /street design, and then the street impact fee. And with that, I'll take any questions.
Thanks, Cole. That was great. I just moved to Austin about a year and a half ago, so I'm still getting to know all the different programs, and that was like really a good overview of what's going on.
Good.
With transportation. Does anyone have any questions? We're kind of shifting gears with Heather's presentation, so I don't want anyone to kind of lose track of the specificity if you want to discuss more of what's going on kind of with the city plans and ordinances and everything.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
I'm wondering, Cole, if you all are doing some sort of re-review of everything with assumptions about people teleworking more after COVID?
Yeah, I mean, the mode share goals, the ones that I showed on the presentation were just our 50-50 mode share goal. But within the ASMP itself, we did identify targets for each of the individual modes, including teleworking. And teleworking was one that we really expect and hope doubles in its share. But as we saw over the course of the year, it really did more than double. And it almost was a glimpse into the past, really, before the growth came to Austin, and what the impact was on congestion or lack thereof. Nonetheless, that basically from an annual basis, we're definitely monitoring the changes in the transportation landscape. We definitely want teleworking to be a strong piece of the puzzle, but we're also very excited to see that Project Connect, which was included in the ASMP as a very important piece of the puzzle, was approved in the November referendum. So we hope that transit continues to have a huge piece of the mode share goal.
Cool, thank you.
Cole, I have a question. If I recall, the demand that's used to calculate the street impact fee is based upon the TIA for each development. Do I remember that correctly?
Effectively, yeah.
Okay. To follow up on Catherine's question, we have seen an awful lot of shift to teleworking, and many companies have indicated that they wish to allow at least some percentage of their employees to continue that, which of course will impact both commercial and residential development. In the process of evaluating TIAs, is the city going to allow assessments of that in the development of the TIAs?
Yeah, good point. That's something that I hope as the TCM, the updated TCM becomes available for the public, that there's an opportunity to see how we incorporate transportation demand management strategies into our TIA process, because if a development is able to prove that they're establishing TDM as one of their mitigation tools, then yes, they're effectively reducing their vehicle trips that they are subsequently having to mitigate. So through the TCM process and guidelines for how to do a TIA, hopefully the public will be able to see how that all comes together. And just to put a plug, we do hope to host a couple of development workshops over the summer to talk just specifically about this. But it's certainly one of those things where we're always in the mode of learning based on what's happening today. So we'll always kind of be in a lagging position of understanding whether or not we do count the full square footage of a commercial building at a certain, per employee per, 1,000 square feet, or do we expect those numbers to kind of shrink or grow based on the actual people in those buildings?
That's actually going to be a very interesting learning process as we look at demand for commercial space. There's been a lot of speculation about, why are companies going to need to have office space for so many employees if so many are working from home, and many employers are subleasing space as a consequence of that. That's going to be interesting to see how that evolves over time. But also, as they do go back to the office, are they going to reverse the trend of trying to cram more employees into the same amount of space when they need more space around them just for their health and safety? And how long will our memory be to keep doing that before we, just throw caution to the wind and, proceed with whatever packs them in? It's going to be an interesting question. A similar one is going to be, if people have the option to work from home, will those who choose to work from home when we have bad weather offset the number of people who would otherwise use alternative transportation, but suddenly decide they need to drive to work because it's raining pretty nastily and they don't want to get out in it? So it's going to be very interesting to see how that works over time as well. So I think there's going to be some interesting stuff out there for us all to watch.
Yeah, those are great points.
Thanks, everyone, for your questions. And I think we'll turn it over to Heather to come at this from a sort of more macro scale about sort of what's going on in Texas and how that sort of impacts and is impacted by sort of a larger climate context. Heather.
Yeah. Thanks, Ashley, for inviting me here. I'm going to start my slides as I'm introducing myself as well and wrangle a bunch of technology. I do everything on a 13-inch laptop, including teach. And so it's I think I'm used to it, and yet it's always an adventure. So I'm Heather Hauser. I'm an associate professor of English at UT Austin. And that very aspect of my introduction might have some of you wondering why I am here. And I think there are a few, so I'm a professor of literary and media studies. These are a couple of my books. And but I think I'm here, at least one of the reasons I'm here is that I'm a co-founder and former chair of the Planet Texas 2050 initiative, which I will talk about a bit more, but it's a major climate resilience project at UT Austin. I think another reason I'm here is that I served on the Transportation and Land Use Advisory Group for the Austin Climate Equity Plan. And I was sort of there because of my Planet Texas hat. But I also, I'm a bike commuter in Austin. I was hit by cars 3 times. I have a lot of feelings about transportation in Austin. So that was one way I saw myself functioning in that group. But I think a big reason I am here in this conversation, but also in those other 2 contexts, is that I'm a big advocate for storytelling, and really as storytelling as a bridge between the past, present, and the future. And really as one of the best tools we have to eradicate injustices through planning and design. And I will put my cards, those are already some cards on the table, but I am not a planner or a designer or an architect. So I'm coming in at sort of the macro scale in terms of my Planet Texas involvement, but I think also just thinking about some of these bigger questions about stories in the context of growth and the climate plan. And so one reason I, emphasize the story aspect is certainly climate change is a numbers game, right? It's things like greenhouse gas concentrations, it's things like sea temperature, air temperature rise, all of this, it's often thought of as this numbers game. But I think, it becomes climate crisis through the stories of how it impacts people. So stories, to me, I should say, include everything from narratives to images to performances, visual art of all kinds. But it really, to me, that gets at what it means for people to live in and through these climate impacts, as well as through the changes we make to our cities in response to them. And also that stories are the place where we envision futures that don't replicate the systems that really produce the catastrophic climate change and other problems that we're facing. And so, again, with some of those cards on the table, I wanted to just talk for a second, or probably more like a couple minutes, about this this Planet Texas 2050 initiative. I won't go into it too much, but because that could be its own full presentation. But this is really UT Austin's first large scale climate project that has a large investment of time and money and brain power at a high level at the university. And the aim of this project is to examine climate crisis in Texas and to really think about some resilient strategies that can be put into place that don't only not propagate inequities, but also seek to redress some of them. And really, the recent past and it's the present, is raising this question of, are we prepared for the futures of Texas and Austin in particular? So on the one hand here, we have, of course, Storm Uri and the cascading disasters that followed from it that we're not out of even today. And we also have the issue of the state's population growing, and Cole, noted the Austin specific numbers. We have the new census data here. And all of this really puts strains on, that is climate impacts, weather disasters, growing population. This all puts strains on environmental amenities, infrastructure, and really also the social supports around all those things. And so Planet Texas, takes this all into consideration and is thinking about, Texas's population growing. It's at almost 29 million today, and it's expected to double by 2050. And then, of course, we have all these climate impacts and that question, are we prepared, and how can we make ourselves more prepared? And so there's still a lot with this project. We're coming at it from a lot of angles. There's still a lot we don't actually know about how natural systems interact with social systems. And so there are a lot of data-driven projects studying things like hydrology, biodiversity, disease pathogens. And it also includes projects about gathering data about Texas's urban communities. So there's a project called Texas Metro Observatory, actually led by a team of mostly School of Architecture researchers and practitioners. And this is looking at things like demographic trends, social vulnerability, water usage, infrastructure, and really trying to offer a lot of dashboards and visualizations to understand sort of the confluence of all of these different factors and how they will impact specific communities. Like this social vulnerability index mapped onto climate stresses, gets at the level of these neighborhoods in Austin. And I gave you the URL if you want to check it out a bit more. But back to my opening point, that numbers certainly show the social, ecological, and technical fabric of our urban areas. But that's really not enough. There's a scholar who says like numbers aren't nerves, right? That there's something more that we need. And so we need, again, stories to grasp the shocks and stresses of climate crisis and how they're really braided into these social inequities and vulnerabilities in the language of this study. And so Planet Texas also has supported a number of projects in the sort of artistic, historical, and cultural geographic domain. I could go on, these are ones that I led, so I could talk about them at length, but I gave you a link here. This is a project by an artist named Marie Lorenz. It's called The Gray Belt. And it's actually thinking about the network of waterways and wastewater systems really running through Austin, but extending far beyond with the Colorado River, and how people relate to those spaces, whether they even understand them as part of the city. And that term gray belt is meant to certainly evoke the green belt, like this treasured gem of the city that everyone recognizes, whereas the gray belt is often somehow overlooked when it's not those more beautiful recreational spaces. And so how do we relate to our environments that maybe are overlooked, invisibilized, undervalued, and how can those relationships be shifted so that we aim to like protect and utilize them responsibly? Another project or aspect of Texas Water Stories is looking at the Panhandle and West Texas and talking to farmers and ranchers to understand their languages around water as it's diminishing, as aquifers are drying up, and really trying to get out of, and this is a point I'll return to later, like get out of some of the languages of researchers or planners or climatologists. And what is the language of people who might not even think of it as climate change and in fact might reject that language, but they're actually living through these transformations. So how can we learn the stories, hear the vocabularies of a diverse group of people, and really to understand how people relate to their environments, how they're experiencing stresses to their environments and social systems, and how then they practice resilience sort of on the ground. And so like these are some projects within Planet Texas really attuned to history and story, and experiences of maybe oppression, but also triumph and response that are at the heart of making that data meaningful and potentially actionable in the future. And so it was interesting when I was asked to be a part of the climate equity plan, because that actually, this is something, the importance of listening and community involvement is something that is evolving within Planet Texas 2050. But that is something that was really built in at the beginning of the climate equity plan process. It certainly, and I know you've had people talk about it before, so I'll try not to duplicate things, but there was the community ambassadors program. There were people on the advisory groups from all like parts of Austin, all professions, experiences, races and other aspects of identity. And so that was really at the heart of the project. And I sort of want to talk through in the rest of my time about, how moving forward we can think about that storytelling and listening being part of implementation in these specific goals of the plan. So in the transportation and land use section, you'll find like, this is really enforcing or just echoing what Cole was talking about. Transportation is this huge and will soon become the largest contributor to Austin's greenhouse gas emissions. And so we can't ignore it, right? It has to be at the center of our climate equity planning. And so the vision of this group that we all came up with quite collectively was to cultivate, and this is the language from the draft report, cultivate a person-centered network of complete communities that meets the needs of low-income communities and communities of color of all ages and abilities. And footnote that I encouraged them to remove communities so often from this sentence, but it stayed in here. So it is a hard one to say, but like the idea is there, right? Person-centered and really having an inclusive perspective on what complete actually means. And so here are some of the goals. I think the slide Ashley had up earlier had them in miniature. So, growing businesses in the growth centers and corridors, new housing also located in those centers and corridors while keeping and increasing deeply affordable housing, increasing public transit, not just the trips, not just counting those, but the actual distance traveled as well, and the same for people-powered transportation. And really, threaded through our discussions about like arriving at these goals were really anxieties rooted in the history of Austin and really every other city in this country. And this question of, can the city grow on the one hand while reaching these goals of climate mitigation and resilience, but also can it do so without exacerbating some of the really deep racial and class inequalities in the city? And I think one of the things that comes up often in our conversations, but also really in the conversation about design justice or whatever term you prefer, is that, improvement is often a conduit to displacement and gentrification. So you put in a beautiful transit hub, multi-use spaces, more green spaces, you put in bike pathways, walking trails, and parks. You all know all this, but like this was part of the conversation of like, these are awesome ideas that will lead to these goals. And yet, are they going to create more displacement or gentrification? And so that is something that I think moving forward, thinking about reaching those goals and strategies for reaching them. In preparation for this talk, this is not something I have thought about before so much, but was thinking through this idea of planning for abundance or designing for abundance rather than only growth. So I think those words can sound quite similar, right? Like they're about increase or plenty or whatever. But I think abundance requires asking what it takes to prioritize the needs and the thriving of those who don't traditionally get to make the decisions, rather than those who hold the power and hold the money. And I'm inspired in this, just in case you're like jonesing for some reading or whatever, by this new book by a geographer and Asian American studies scholar named Candace Fujikane called Mapping Abundance for a Planetary Future, which is about like mapping and performance and farming practices in Hawaii among the indigenous population, but where this idea of abundance as against like scarcity and growth for some and not for others is at the heart of it. And also I saw a talk at the School of Architecture in the fall at UT Austin by Liz Ogbu, who's a practicing designer and, as she calls herself, a social innovator, where also like abundance was not her term, but like her practice is really exemplifying, centering the needs and stories and the collaboration of people in the communities in which one works to avoid displacement or gentrification or other problems. And so I think one big thing out of these inspirations and my thinking about designing for abundance is that part of the answer has to be confronting that disadvantage has its sources in advantage. So the idea of like fixing a problem of the poor or of people of color or the disabled is actually tracking back to how those so-called problems are really located and propping up wealth and privilege in the city. And so like these, I think Liz Ogbu's work is really central here. And also a lot of our thinking into the climate plan goals were considering that reality. And so I think attaining this, designing for abundance, really requires storytelling and listening. So back to that opening point. And I think of stories really as a way of like chipping away at our embedded and often embodied ways of knowing. So as we design growth corridors, or maybe we'll start calling them abundance corridors, there's certain ways of knowing that are likely to be prioritized. And that's probably the ways of knowing of like everyone in this room, right? Like designers, engineers, architects, maybe ecologists, city code folks. These ways of knowing, they're certainly not monolithic, like it's not one singular way of looking at problems or answering them. And they're absolutely indispensable. I'm pro it all, but they tend to be driven by numbers, by a certain relationship to people and place that, and the histories of a place that can cut out or ignore other ways of knowing. And so I think that this was an issue we had in Planet Texas 2050, where there was a certain, it's often called the information deficit model for climate action. An idea like you just get people the data, you just get people facts, you just give them the tools, and action and the right response will follow. It's a very paternalistic relationship to people and problems. And so, we're still sort of working our way outside of that mindset because it tends to reinforce structures of power, and solutions tend to be solutions for only the most fortunate. And so what we had to wrestle with, and I think what the climate plan addressed in its planning stage quite well, is that knowledge takes many shapes, yet it's also hard. It's hard for us to see outside of the shapes we're in. And so I think Liz Ogbu gave this amazing example when she was thinking about, like, if you're an architect designing a glossy new office building, how do you listen to and take the experience of the person cleaning the building into consideration? And when I was thinking about the goals of the transportation and land use section, how do you take the experience of, say, a child who's walking to school with their sibling from or through that area because their parents are off to work? Like, how do you think of the space from that perspective, as well as the perspective of those, the businesses living or in that area? And so this idea of getting out of silos, I've also taken inspiration from a scholar in the area of Black studies named Christina Sharp. In this book, she has this phrase, "We must become undisciplined." And that's, for me, inspiring a lot of projects and thought. But in this context, I think it's, that planners, designers, and researchers aren't the only producers or repositories of knowledge. And that really expertise resides in all areas of a project. And by weaving a tapestry of stories, we're able, or even maybe forced, to think outside of those frameworks and ways of knowing that we've really become cemented in. And so I think that so many of the tactics for attaining the goals in the equity plan, at least in the transportation and land use section, they invite this kind of listening and historical exploration. So this goal of increased miles traveled through people-powered transportation, that requires, of course, building out the bicycle and sidewalk network, which Cole also talked about, but also thinking about the long history of the area. And I was just thinking of the person's comment, how long will our memory be? Well, that I think requires this kind of like thinking of people and communities as repositories of these stories, and listening to and traveling with them to ground truth the data must become part of the accessibility and mobility and growth planning that we have. And so do I have a couple more minutes? How are we on time? I can't see it on my computer.
Yeah, no problem. We're right at 6:30 right now, but I'm happy to stay on, and it looks like others are too. So if people do need
well,
to,
maybe I'll like just talk through this really quickly. That there's this novel I teach all the time called Animals People. It's actually set in India in the wake of the Bhopal chemical disaster. And there's the main character is named Animal, and he is the narrator, and he is offering the reader his perspective of this really busy, sort of chaotic from his perspective city, but also someone who his spine was torqued because of the chemical disaster. So he walks on his hands and his feet. And so he thinks about the space from that perspective. And when like experts come from outside, whether a journalist or a doctor or human rights advocate, he's always sort of like, they can't see that my experience of this place has a certain character that they cannot understand as they're trying to fix the problems. And by the end of the novel, he decides like not to have a surgery to change his spine, especially because he has this vantage that he doesn't see as disabled anymore, right? It's like, it's offering its own sense of this space and its relationships. And I'm not saying like that means we shouldn't do anything. A lot happens in the novel. That decision's kind of incidental, but there's a that it's really, this novel like exemplifies this need for like expertise to listen to the people sort of on the ground, quite literally, before implementing what might be seen as solutions from one perspective, but not from another. And so I think that is just, if you're looking for a novel to read, I highly recommend it with sort of these lenses of ways of knowing, listening, and sort of the histories of place embodied in people. Just some lessons and takeaways there. So I will stop, and thank you again, Ashley, for inviting me.
thank you, Heather. I appreciate that. Just discussion. I was writing down so many book recommendations. So thanks so much. I know we're a little bit over, but if anyone has a few questions or comments, feel free. We'll stick around for a few minutes.
I have a question. I'm wondering, Heather, whether you know if say, since the Uri storm, when I'm thinking about how politicians look at things, well, also scientists and planners, it's worst case, best case, expected case scenario, and there are all these graphs and everything. And so I'm thinking, when people are looking back at that storm, are they still, is everyone looking at it in that way, or are people actually collecting stories about what happened to people in order to learn what the real impacts were, what the clever ways of surviving were, so that we can learn from everybody's experiences as opposed to a bunch of graphs?
Oh, that's a great, I was about to say, yes, absolutely. And then I remember I paused and I'm like, am I thinking of the efforts to collect COVID stories? Because I know in Austin, there's like the library and other places have been looking, soliciting stories of people's COVID experience. And I don't know if that has been happening with Yuri, though it's something I talked to some of the researchers who are starting a new project in Planet Texas 2050. We talked about that as we were like texting during the storm, actually, like, how will this be captured? And so I'm not aware, if anyone else is, please shout it out. I'm not aware of that for Yuri, though I haven't gone out and done the research, but I do know it's happening for COVID. And I wonder if there will also just be some cross-pollination, between those stories, since they were coincident. But I think that's it's a marvelous point, as people are now just finally starting to, emerge from that physically and psychologically.
Yeah, I'm also wondering, I know that politicians are really busy people, but I recently read this book that I've been sitting around for a long time. And then when I was waiting to get my shot for 2 hours, I had a chance to start it. And it was called Dry by Neil Shusterman. And it's this young adult novel about what happens in LA when Nevada and Arizona decide to cut the water off to LA and not send any there. And it's a horrific novel, but really fun to read. But the takeaway I got from it was that there are people who have the means to plan ahead for things like that and to think that they themselves are secure, but ultimately, when most people are not secure, the people who think they're secure aren't secure either. And so I'm thinking that more people should read maybe fiction related to the things that might happen to us, to give them ideas about what could happen.
Well, I agree. That's like my bread and butter. And I have probably not a million, but hundreds maybe recommendations, though when you ask me on the fly, they all go away. So it's always good to give me a minute, or maybe even more than a minute, to think it through. But it's so true in terms of how a lot of artists, whether they're writers or, filmmakers or dramatists or whatever, they often, and this is what my second book was about on the slide, they often incorporate the data from climate science and from other disciplines. It's often quite faithful to that data, but it then runs through the scenarios that are maybe not exactly the same as what you will get from a climate model scenario, but often interact with it and kind of add flesh to it, or think about the parts it can't capture. And another writer, if you want to be terrified about drought scenarios, his name is Paolo Bacigalupi, which is neither easy to say nor to write, but I can try to write it in the chat. He wrote a novel called, several novels in this vein, but one called The Water Knives, where people from Texas have experienced drought and no longer have access to water. And there are these water wars basically between the states. And so it also plays out these scenarios of like political power, but also sort of capitalizing on the rights or access to something at a stage early enough that you then can sort of manipulate the whole situation as it plays out. But, I just thought of that as you were talking, so I wanted to recommend it. But in general, like, I think that idea of like best, worst, and sort of middle of the road scenario does get played out in a lot of the literature and other modes of thinking through climate impacts. So, yeah.
To me, it's a really interesting question about accessing the stories as well. So first there's collecting them and making sure that is another point of data collection that we have. But then also, in design, there's a lot of conversation about data-driven design. And so, even in the health and well-being space, we can measure if people have this much of a view, or how much that impacts their health. And if the air quality and the filtration rates are this much, then that will impact health in a measurable way. And so to me, I'm like, we can look up that information in a sense, right? We can access the study that has already been done. And so if there is this story collecting going on, you know, then how are we able to access that to use it as another data point in our data-driven design, you know, in addition to having conversations with people on each project, but then, you know, where is the collective resource of that storytelling, you know?
Yeah, that is like at the heart also of Planet Texas 2050 that I don't think has been worked out, but there's a climate modeling platform. I mean, that it's trying to integrate data in understanding data as everything essentially. And so it's a project that's going to be long in the making, but its aim is to how can we provide a platform where if you're looking at, say, a particular area, it probably will not be at the level of the building. In fact, I know it will not be at the level, at the scale of the building, but like a different area. And, you know, sorry, I was about to go down the tangent, but I won't. That, you know, you could have the sort of quantitative data, all these metrics that you might be accustomed to looking for, but then you might have photographs. You might have a story of a person, like historically. You might even have ancient archaeological, you know, information. And how can that provide a picture and play into, if not like a purely quantitative scenario, but other ways of you know, imagining and designing the future. And there are some other projects that have tried to do that. And yeah, none of this is easy, I should have said. Like, I say all this, but none of it's easy, but like sort of the aspiration of how to bring that in from the beginning, especially in your considerations of as we are thinking about the implementation of these goals.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's very exciting that that's part of the goal to integrate that into the platform. As you say, of course, it's not easy, but as long as we're moving in that direction, that seems better than not, right?
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate everyone hanging out a few extra minutes with us tonight. And thank you again to Cole and Heather for your time and for sharing this great information. It was a really good balance between sort of what's going on the ground and sort of what are these bigger aspirations that we're also working towards. So really appreciate both of you sharing with us tonight.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And thanks everyone for being here. Please join us for our upcoming events. Keep an eye on our website and we'll see you soon. Happy Thursday.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Okay, I don't know. Will it just stop? If I stop the recording, does it save automatically?
Yeah.
I think so, yeah.